Hi, welcome. I'm Rabbi Stuart Weinblatt, and we're going to be starting in just a moment or so. By way of introduction, today's call with Einat Wilf is sponsored by the Zionist Rabbinic Coalition, which is a grassroots coalition of rabbis from across all denominations who are committed to promoting Jewish unity and peoplehood. We invite you to learn more, to read more about our mission, as well as sign up for our upcoming calls, become a member by going to our website, which is zionistrabbis.org. Upcoming calls are on this coming Monday, July 6th at 1:30 p.m. with Bougie Herzog, who is the chairman of the Jewish Agency. And we'll engage in an important conversation with rabbis about the nature of our work and his work as well. In addition to that, then on Wednesday, July 15th, David Makovsky, who is with the Washington Institute, has been very involved in many Middle East peace negotiations, will be our guest, and he will talk to us. By then, we assume we'll have an idea as to what will happen in regard to Israel's thoughts about the annexation, extension of sovereignty, and so we'll look forward to a thorough, in-depth analysis by David. And then July 22, Danny Dayan will be speaking. Danny is the Consul General in Israel, in New York of Israel, often referred to as the ambassador of Israel to the American Jewish community. He'll be completing this 4 years with the American Jewish community in that capacity for Israel. And so he will be our guest and have a chance to reflect on that and also some other very important issues. Upon the completion of this series of these, what will have been 5 calls, we will then be scheduling a Zoom conference call where we can discuss and process these conversations, the extension of sovereignty, other issues of interest to rabbis as well. So look for more information about that. If you're not on our mailing list, please do feel free to go to the website and we'll be happy to add you. With that, I want to now introduce our speaker and get right into the fascinating and important conversation that we have today with Dr. Einat Wilf. Dr. Wilf is one of the leading thinkers on matters of foreign policy, economics, education, Israel, and Zionism. I've heard her speak a number of times and have always come away learning something that I wasn't aware of before. She was a member of the Israeli parliament where she served as part of the Labor Party, where she served as chair of the Education Committee and on the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Prior to that, she had also served as a foreign policy advisor to Shimon Peres. Dr. Wilf has her BA from Harvard, an MBA from INSEAD in France, and a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. She has written 6 books that explore key issues in Israeli society. Her most recent book is called Telling Our Story, a collection of essays on Israel, Zionism, and the Path to Peace. And the book we're talking about today, The War of Return, which is subtitled, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. She co-authored it with Adi Schwartz of Haaretz. So, Dr. Wilf, Einat, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Thanks for joining us today. Let me jump right in because I read the book and I've got like a million questions for you. Not quite a million, but I've got a lot of questions. And also some people have sent in questions. Anyone who would like to send a question, by the way, there is a Q&A, and please do feel free to write your questions and I'll try and get to them as well. So Einat, let me just start off with the first question, and that is, how is it that what is different about the way Palestinian refugees have been treated than all other refugees, especially within the context of the 20th century? It's important to begin there.
So thank you for having me. And we can summarize the entire political process of the 20th century as the transition from empire to nation state. In the beginning of the 20th century, much of the earth is governed by empires, and at the end of the 20th century, much of the earth is governed by nation states. And the bloody process of this transition is the 20th century, 2 world wars, decolonization, civil wars. In this bloody process, there are many wars and many, many refugees. Tens of millions of refugees, if not hundreds of millions, across Europe, Asia, Africa. Now, in this transition, because of this process, the general rule is that refugees, once created in the course of war, people flee during war, people are expelled. The general rule is they do not come back, because the understanding is, and it's very true, that if refugees claim their former homes in what became now a new state, Pakistan, India, Germany, Poland, it will reopen the war that gave rise to the refugee situation to begin with. So refugees do not return unless a sovereign state wishes them. So if Poland wants people of Polish descent, it can do so. But refugees do not return against the will of the new sovereign states that are established in this process, except in the whole 20th century, the Palestinians. And the Palestinians, uniquely among all refugee groups throughout the 20th century, were indulged in their desire to roll back the clock, to return to their homes, and to basically undo the consequences of war. And we're speaking, of course, about the war of 1948, the war that the Arab countries and the Arabs, later to be called Palestinians, waged against partition and against the emergence of a sovereign Jewish state in any part of the land, in any borders. They failed to achieve that goal in 1948, but what is very clear is that they do not view it as a final defeat. They view it merely as a blip, as a minor setback, and they expect to resume the war against Zionism and the nascent Jewish state at a later stage, which indeed they do. And part of saying that they do not accept the outcome of the war is to keep the notion that they are still refugees. As a result, an organization that was established for their resettlement, UNRWA, becomes from a temporary organization, which should have closed within a few years after settling the refugees, into a still temporary, but one that still exists after 70 years, that has essentially become an organization that perpetuates for the Palestinians, by now into the 5th generation, the idea that the war of 1948 is not over, that they are still refugees from that war, despite being born decades after it was over, and that one day, this is the most important, that one day they can undo the consequences of 1948 through this idea of return.
So in that regard, their claim is different than the claim of all other refugees in the 20th century, you're saying?
A lot of refugees wanted to return. One of the stories we bring in the book, we bring many other refugee situations in the Indian subcontinent, in Africa, in Europe, but really the most striking one is of the German refugees who, by the way, after the war, after Germany already surrendered and came under the occupation of the Allies, they are brutally expelled. And we have some scenes of that described in the book, from Poland, from Czechoslovakia. About 12 million Germans, 2 million die in the process of expulsion because it was so brutal. And like the Palestinians, they want to return home. Not all of them were Nazis. I mean, they were expelled because they were ethnic Germans, not because they were individually culpable for anything. They want to return home. That's a natural desire. But unlike the Palestinians, no one indulges the desire of the German refugees to go back to their homes in what became Poland, used to be Eastern Germany, but what became Poland, or the Sudetenlands in Czechoslovakia, for obvious reasons. It was clear that if Germans will return to Poland and Czechoslovakia, it will be World War III. So no one indulges them, and over time, they understand that it's not going to happen. This was the message. This was the message for all refugees throughout the 20th century. Tough, it's tragic, you lost your homes, but move on and build your future wherever you are right now.
So the natural follow-up question then is, how did this right or this claim become appropriated to the Palestinians? How did they succeed then in changing the dynamics, what exists for the rest of the world, and that they have a unique status?
So we really need to understand the geopolitics of the 1950s. It's fairly easy. The Arab world is still relatively united. The Arab League presents a united front when it comes to Israel and Zionism, in complete rejection of it. Oil is still very, very important for the American economy, for the reconstruction of Europe. It's the Cold War. There's a genuine fear in the West that if the West will anger the Arabs, they will go over to the Soviet side. So all of these things come together so that when the Arabs basically threatened the West into keeping UNRWA open, because America, the UK, they realized already in the 1950s, we describe it in the book, that UNRWA is a useless organization. It fails to settle even one refugee because the Arabs refuse to be settled and to move on. So the West knows it's a useless organization in the 1950s. It didn't take long to realize that. But when they want to close it down, they basically receive a threat from all the Arab states saying that you don't want to do that. There will be consequences and dire consequences for doing so. And that's the moment when the Western support of UNRWA becomes essentially a racket. They're paying an annual bribe to appease the Arab world. This is the Eisenhower doctrine. They believe that by appeasing the Arab world, it would help them. I don't think it worked out so well, but that's the Eisenhower doctrine. And in many ways, what we have now is a complete reversal of that situation, which is why Adi and I both think it's an opportune moment for change. The Soviet bloc is gone. The Arab world is now united. And you even have some Arab voices in support of Israel. And certainly oil is not what it used to be. So the Arab world is not in the position it was in the 1950s to force the West to continue to indulge this vision of an ongoing war against Israel.
So one of the things you've mentioned now is UNRWA. I don't think we've quite defined it yet for people who are on the call and who are listening. Tell us a little bit about UNRWA, what it is, how it was formed, what's unique about it, and how you go into the detail of how it really has helped to really not even perpetuate, but in many respects create the problem itself. So I think it's important for us to go into that now.
So UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, is established as a temporary agency after the war. And in that sense, it's not unique. We tell the story in the book of UNCRA, a UN agency for the Korean refugees, which happens at about the same time. The reason that they're established as temporary agencies is that the assumption is that within a few short years, they'll settle the refugees and close shop. This is exactly what UNCRA does. Within a few years, it settles all the refugees from the Korean War, about 2 million. None of them returned to their homes in North Korea. They are all settled. UNCRA does it with less money that was allocated to UNRWA. And look at where South Korea is today. It could have been the Palestinians. The Palestinians refused to cooperate with UNRWA, refused to be settled, refused to move on. The Arab countries refused to cooperate with UNRWA, but they still want the money of the West. So this is the process that I described in the 1950s, where basically the Arab countries are able to force the hand of the West to keep UNRWA open while continuing to fund it. So UNRWA still today, after 70 years, is still amazingly a temporary organization that is constantly renewed every 2 or 3 years. They recently tweeted how proud they are to celebrate 70 years. And I thought it was amazing because they should be ashamed that they're still existing after 70 years. They should have closed down after 3 or 4 years of successfully settling the refugees. And they were giving a lot of money and assistance to that end. But because of the Arab refusal to cooperate, they basically failed to do so. And once the West caves into Arab pressure to keep UNRWA open, they realized that UNRWA is not going to settle anyone. That's already clear in the 50s. So they have to do something. So from that moment on, UNRWA becomes this massive organization of education and healthcare. It becomes essentially the welfare state of the Palestinian people. And this is really when the Palestinians become a people. One of the most shocking realizations for Adi and I as we researched the book is to realize the critical role UNRWA played in forming a distinct Palestinian national identity. The connection between an education system and nation building is nationalism 101. That's for everyone. So there's nothing wrong in the idea of a Palestinian nation emerging in the UNRWA schools and the refugee camps. The problem is that the kind of national identity which is forged in the UNRWA schools and the refugee camps is one that is singularly focused on revenge and return. So in the book, we tell the story of the perpetrators of the Munich massacre of the Israeli Olympic athletes. We tell how almost all of them were children of the refugee camps who were born after the war, but were raised on a steady diet, that they are a people to whom a unique and incomparable injustice was done, and that they have a role, and their role in life is to take back in their mind what was unjustly taken from them. And this is what breeds a people who are willing to murder and mutilate athletes in an Olympic arena, because they believe their cause is so valuable and just that all means justify it. So there is a direct link between the refugee camp culture, the UNRWA schools, and the birth of terrorism in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. It's a direct link between the notion of return and revenge and the idea that all means are justified in the service of this goal.
So one of the things you go into detail in your book is how it is that this ideology, the sense of victimhood, becomes such a very central part of the educational system. I was just curious when I read that section about the Palestinian terrorists from Lebanon who went and participated in the Munich massacre. Has any research been done? What percentage of individuals involved in Palestinian terrorist acts actually come from refugee camps or were educated by UNRWA?
I'm not aware of a study per se on that, but there's no doubt that it is the vast majority, because this is where the Palestinian people actually exist. And we bring a quote from a Fatah person who says in the 60s, he says, "We Fatah can only train one warrior at a time, but UNRWA prepares the minds and hearts of the masses." So Fatah itself is aware that what creates the basis from which they can then recruit the terrorists is the UNRWA schools and the refugee camps, where the children are being brought up to believe that they have a cause to which they should die and dedicate their lives, which is the cause of return of Palestine from the river to the sea. So it's a clear and direct connection. And we also show in the book that Palestinians or Arab refugees who did kind of didn't go through the UNRWA system, went to Egyptian schools or other schools, they have no sense of a unified Palestinian history. The idea of a Palestinian history that begins at the Balfour Declaration and all of that is only begun to be taught in the UNRWA schools. It doesn't exist beforehand.
So, and I want to come back to a little bit of that ideology moment, but before that, just going back to one other point, and that is this aspect of the way in which UNRWA is set up, which reports directly to the Secretary General of the United Nations, responsible only for Palestinian refugees, whereas the other relief agency is for all the several 100 million refugees around the world. It just seems to be so disproportional and so unjust in that regard, and yet it's perpetuated. I wanted to ask you along those lines then, if you could share with us, what are some of the things that are unique to Palestinian refugees? So this is one aspect of it, having a separate agency. By the way, please remember, feel free to send questions to us. The passing on of refugee status, not being integrated and resettled, running things by themselves. Just share with us a little bit. What are some of the things that are so different and out of whack, so to speak, which help, I think, and are so very crucial because it helps us to understand why it is that this Israeli-Palestinian problem seems to be so intractable and so difficult to solve?
So at about the same time that UNRWA is created, the UN establishes the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, which is actually a UN permanent organ, which is responsible for caring for refugees all around the world, initially in Europe, but ultimately all around the world, based on the Refugee Convention. The reason, now UNRWA was created as a loophole, because when the Arab countries realized that the Refugee Convention and the UNHCR are committed to settling the refugees. The UNHCR, and we show stories up to the present, we tell stories of refugees in Bhutan and Nepal. The UNHCR doesn't sit around and deal with issues of who started the war and who's to blame and is it wrong how it went about. UNHCR works on an individual basis. There's the refugee situation. They give a temporary protection to the refugee while trying to find a personal solution for that refugee, either by integrating them in the country to which they fled or finding for them a citizenship in another country. And this is why all refugee situations over time disappear. This is why we have no refugees from the 1940s or 50s. And I mean, you have long-term refugee situations, but even there, the numbers always go down because UNHCR actively works on settling the refugees. So, but the Arab countries knew that if the Palestinians would be treated by the international standard, within a few short years, there would be no Palestinian refugee problem. And they wanted to keep it alive because they wanted to keep the war against Israel and Zionism alive. And the refugees were a key element in not ending the war. So as a result, because UNRWA has this loophole, UNRWA can do basically whatever it wants, and it's not subjected to any international standard. So UNRWA doesn't settle a single refugee, doesn't even try. UNRWA basically works for decades without ever trying to end the process. UNRWA automatically gives generation after generation the registered refugee status on its books. UNRWA never takes anyone off its books. So for example,
even people who die.
Well, people who die, ultimately they were forced to do. But for example, a lot of the refugees who are listed on UNRWA in Lebanon and Syria, about 1 million, we now have data that at least 2/3 of them, if not more, have long ago left Syria and Lebanon. My favorite Syrian refugee, I mean a Palestinian refugee in Syria, is the multi-millionaire father of supermodels Gigi and Bella Hadid, who lives in a very nice mansion in LA. He was born in a refugee camp in Syria, and he was never taken off the books because UNRWA never takes anyone off the books. They don't monitor what happens to the people. For UNHCR, if someone became a citizen of the US, they're taken off the books. UNHCR has what's called cessation clauses, which means there are ways by which people stop being refugees. Primarily, they become citizens. UNRWA does not recognize any cessation of refugee status. So for example, 2.2 million of the refugees that UNRWA registers, that's about 40% of the total, they are citizens of Jordan. They've been citizens of Jordan since 1950. UNRWA still calls them refugees. They're not refugees. They're citizens of a functioning state. Another 2.2 million live in the West Bank and Gaza under the Palestinian Authority. If they're in the West Bank and Gaza, where exactly are they refugees from? They've been born in the West Bank and Gaza. They've never been displaced by war. UNHCR would never consider such people refugees. And as I mentioned, most of the people in Syria and Lebanon have long left. So UNRWA basically, through the combination of never settling anyone, never taking anyone off its books unless they die, but if they become a citizen, they don't take them off its books, they don't monitor, and giving refugees automatically this status in perpetuity, has created an inflationary mechanism by which the numbers only ever go up. They can never go down, which is how we got from about 700,000 refugees at the end of the war to more than 5.5 million refugees who are registered by UNRWA today.
And the Arab contribution to UNRWA, economic contribution, would be how much?
Close to zero. Basically, as it was from the 1950s, the Arab countries wanted the Western money, but they didn't want to actually settle the refugees, and UNRWA was a way of doing that. So the UNRWA budget is about $1 billion a year, which is entirely financed by the West. Until recently, the US financed a third of it. Now it's financed almost entirely by Europe, the European Union, European countries, Australia, Japan, who are led to believe that somehow they're supporting a humanitarian organization, whereas they're actually supporting a political organization that keeps the War of 1948 open. And the Arab countries do not give money to UNRWA because in their view, the whole problem was created by UN. They have nothing to do with it. In their mind, they've done above and beyond by being the places to which the refugees have fled. Occasionally, you'll have a Gulf state or Saudi who will give money to a specific project, but they do not fund the ongoing $1 billion a year operations of UNRWA.
And so they've kept them, for the most part, in these Arab countries in refugee camps. I can't help but think it goes counter to the general aspect of Arab culture, which is, you know, if we believe in Haknasat Orchim, Alachat Kama V'chama, they certainly believe in it that much more, of welcoming people and so on. And yet what they've done, so it's obviously this political aspect of it is very significant. Now, when I think it was about 2 years ago, the Trump administration decided the United States was going to stop funding UNRWA. It came, I don't remember seeing a single article or op-ed piece anywhere that talked about any of the issues that you're raising as the reason for it. It was, and I remember reading articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, talking about all the wonderful humanitarian work that UNRWA does and the education, and that this was now all going to stop. Why is it that the message of what the reality of what UNRWA is doing and how it is indoctrinating in so many places and becoming the breeding ground for these terrorist actions, why does that not get out?
First of all, that's the reason we wrote the book, because I think we realized that there is a massive blind spot in the West to the issue that in our mind, and by the way, in the Palestinians' minds, is the most important issue. The interesting thing is that everyone talked about all the great humanitarian work that UNRWA does, which of course is rubbish. It's merely a front for the political work. You know, it's a bit like the person who goes around breaking glasses and then selling glass, and people will say, isn't it great how he helps all the people with the broken glasses? I mean, they are creating the problem and then giving the services. There would not be a need for the services if they had not perpetuated the situation. But the issue is the Palestinians understood the American action very clearly. When the Americans decided to take away, to defund UNRWA, to take away their third of the funding, they talked about how this is an unsustainable organization with an unsustainable model, of course, because the numbers only ever go up. What the Palestinians themselves, contrary to op-eds in the New York Times, what the Palestinians themselves said was not, oh no, how will we now fund our schools? What they said was the American president is trying to take away our right of return. So the Palestinians get it. The Palestinians see a direct connection between the financial support that the West gives to UNRWA and political support for their dream of return and undoing the state of Israel. The West is willfully blind to that very obvious connection. Adi and I have spent numerous agonizing hours with Western diplomats who deny any such connection. Oh no, we're merely funding a humanitarian organization. The rest needs to be resolved in negotiations. And really, when we lay it out for them, and it's very clear once you bring the facts, I do think in that sense our book is very powerful because it really is just about laying out the facts and the process. It becomes very hard to deny, but then a lot of Western diplomats engage in a process that have come to term. I've invented a word for it. I call it West-plaining, which basically Westerners ignore what Palestinians directly tell them and say things like they don't mean it, they know it's not going to happen. And often I have to tell these Western journalists and diplomats, I'm like, look at the map, open a map. That's what Palestinians are doing. They're opening a map. They see 7 million Jews trying to survive amidst nearly 500 million Arabs and nearly 1.5 billion Muslims. And they rationally conclude that from their perspective, they say this Zionist experiment is not going to last much longer. We threw out the Crusaders, we threw out the French, we threw out the British, we'll throw out the Jews. I mean, so their view from their perspective is entirely rational. Wait another generation, another 5 generations, and ultimately they will return and the land will revert to being Arab from the river to the sea.
So one of the quotes in your book, talking about this aspect of the right of return, you say, faced with the choice between humiliation from a life of poverty and adversity in the refugee camps and the perceived humiliation of accepting Israel as a fait accompli, the refugees chose to remain in the camps. In other words, that the primary goal is not necessarily a state of their own, but rather this right of return, because, and not even just that as itself, but rather because that is the instrument whereby the Jewish nation state will be destroyed. Would you just, expand upon that a little bit? In other words, is that really what it's all about? Is it really about displacing the nation state of the Jewish people? And isn't that one of the reasons why, when Netanyahu a couple of years ago insisted and wanted the Palestinian Authority to recognize Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, that's one of the reasons why that has been brought up?
Precisely. This is the issue. This is it. There's never been another issue. From day one of the conflict over a century ago, it's been about the Arab rejection of the Jewish right to self-determination in the land. And over the decades, it manifests itself in different ways. Opposition to Jewish immigration, opposition to partition, war, terrorism, but it's always the same issue. The idea of return becomes the most important issue when all the other efforts have failed. And that becomes the main instrument, because the instrument of war has failed, and even the instrument of terrorism has failed, and the instrument of massive economic boycotts has failed. So the idea of return remains the only one that keeps alive the possibility that the war of 1948 and the sovereign state of the Jewish people will be undone. One of the things that I'm most proud of in the book is that I think the book gives the Palestinians the respect of listening to what they're saying. The book is mostly about bringing Palestinian voices, listening to what they're saying and taking them seriously, taking them as agents of history who make choices of which they are conscious of the prices. So when Palestinians again and again, faced with the choice of having a state of their own in part of the land, from 37 to the present, but the price of having a state for themselves in part of the land is to acknowledge, to accept that the sovereign state for the Jewish people will remain in the other part of the land. To date, this is a choice that they have continuously rejected, and they have rejected it knowingly, consciously, and with the complete willingness to pay the price. And in that sense, I think the book really respects the Palestinians as historical agents who make choices. And yes, for them repeatedly, I mean, this is where our book began. Our book began because Adi and I both come from the Israeli peace camp. We thought that the entire conflict was about land, land for peace, just end the occupation, give the Palestinians a state. And then we see, both in 2000 with Ehud Barak and in 2008 with Ehud Olmert, we see Arafat and then Abu Mazen walk away from excellent opportunities to end the occupation, to have a sovereign state in the West Bank and Gaza, and all of it, a fully sovereign state that controls its borders with a capital in East Jerusalem, including holy sites. I mean, the entire checklist, and they walk away. And they walk away, and Israelis like Adi and myself, and the entire peace camp for that matter, watched and said, why? Why? How can a people, if they so dearly want to end the occupation, how is it that they walk away from that? And this led us to the drawing board, back to say, okay, so our assumptions about what the conflict is about and what the Palestinians want had to be wrong. And in revisiting those assumptions, we basically realized that the answer was hiding in plain sight. The Palestinians repeatedly told us what they want. We didn't take them seriously because we thought that the moment that they will have a real opportunity to have a state. I mean, in the 1990s, you could legitimately say, yes, we know that Palestinians talk about return, but when they face a real concrete opportunity to have territory, land, sovereignty, liberty, they'll take it and they'll forgo return. But they didn't. They actually decided to give up the possibility of statehood in order to not forgo the battle for a return. And that's the point where Adi and I had to say, I guess they say what they mean and they mean what they say. And we have to come to terms that this is what they really mean.
So putting it in that context helps us to understand why it is that they walked away from those offers, why it is that you point out that there was, interestingly, no dissension in the Palestinian world to say, what are we doing? Why are we walking away from this? Because of that sense of wanting not just to have the right of return, but the right of return in order to replace and displace the Jewish state. I just want to mention one quick thing, especially because this is a call for rabbis, and that is there's something in Christian theology called replacement theology. The notion that Christianity and Jesus came along to replace Judaism. And for the most part, that has been rejected in most Christian theological places these days. It's something highly offensive to Jews. In certain respects, this should be equally offensive in that same kind of a way. And so I want to talk about then in this aspect of the phased in kind of a thing. And then we're also going to get to the question about the annexation and the extension of sovereignty, how that all plays out. So you would contend that it's not a land for peace, that is a misnomer, I assume, that's not what they want. And the subtitle of your book is How Western Indulgence Has Obstructed the Path for Peace. Now you're talking about Western indulgence primarily in terms of funding of UNRWA and perpetuating all of that. But how about the other ways? Do you think that Western, and especially in terms of some of our American peace negotiators, maybe some even among Israelis and others, just don't get it and have missed some of these obvious points here as well? And then let me be a little more direct. How about rabbis? There are times when American rabbis perhaps are a little bit naive and instead of believing what is actually said, have wishful thinking of, well, they don't really mean this or they don't really mean that, or from our perspective, you give a little, you take a little, masa'u matan, that's what that means. We can solve this.
Yes, there's no doubt that there's an ongoing and widespread indulgence of this Palestinian notion. And it comes, there's the whole spectrum. There are those who outright support it. There are those who actually think that the idea of Zionism and a sovereign state for the Jewish people is a terrible idea, and there have always been such people. So yeah, they listen to the Palestinians, they take them seriously, and they're full on in support of that. Then there are people who listen to that, but they don't take it seriously. And that's the vast majority. And they indulge this because they don't take it seriously. I do believe, and I think many of the people we met, if they did take it seriously, they would not behave the way that they do. If they actually understood what they're doing by their indulgence of UNRWA and the payments and this idea that the right of return is a true idea and the notion that it's merely, one of the things we hear from many negotiators is that it's a bargaining chip. And, we don't want to take it away from the Palestinians. First of all, I never understood that this is the role of the West to give bargaining chips to the side. But uh, but the palace, again, this was a legitimate worldview in the 1990s to say, look, it's a bargaining chip. When they will face a real offer, they will bargain it away. But now we have experience. We've seen that they had real offers, and what they bargained away was not this idea of return. What they bargained away was the opportunity at independence and statehood and the end of occupation. So the problem is, of course, is that once you realize that this is the issue, the solutions become more difficult. They require a longer term view. We do not say in the book that peace is impossible, but we do say that peace will never happen unless this issue is confronted head on. There's no use in
But
bringing—
how do we dissuade them of this then? I mean, it is so embedded in their, very ideology, their very sense of people. And in fact, one of the questions that was sent to me was, Benny Morris contends that there was a Palestinian national identity prior to 1948. And yet, by the way, you have a quote from Benny Morris on the back here. So how do we understand that we can all of a sudden, we can't just wave a magic wand and they're going to start saying, okay, you're right. You know what, we should give this up notion. So how can that happen?
You don't wave magic wands, but you can start processes that, and you're right, what we are saying is a necessary condition for the attainment of peace is nothing less than, to use computer language, the reformatting of the Palestinian identity. By the way, they are demanding the same thing. They are saying that peace requires the reformatting of the Jewish identity away from Zionism. And this is where the conflict cannot split the difference. We can split the difference on land. We can split the difference on a lot of issues. We cannot split the difference on identity. So either they will succeed in reformatting Jews away from Zionism, and Jews will say, you know what, fine, we can live anywhere. We don't need the land of Israel. We don't need self-determination. We'll be happy to live as a Jewish minority in an Arab state. Or we will succeed in getting the Palestinians to understand that the Jewish people have a legitimate historical connection and claim and the right to self-determination. How can that happen? This will not happen unless it's under duress. What do we mean? Again, the example we bring is from the Germans. As we said, Germans are brutally expelled after World War II, not because they were Nazis, just because they were ethnic Germans. They want to return. They established associations, political parties. Initially, there's a lot of support for that. People view the expulsions as extremely unjust. Does anyone indulge the German refugees? Of course not. Because as you can imagine, at this point, after 2 world wars and the role that Germany played in them, no one is willing to indulge the idea that Germans will go back to what has now become Poland or Czechoslovakia. It takes a generation, but after 24 years, a German chancellor emerges, Willy Brandt, who when he was opposition leader in the 60s was sympathetic to the German refugees and their claims. But then he goes in 1970, signs an agreement with Poland in which West Germany basically renounces its claims on the territory, acknowledges this border. And after signing the agreement, he goes to give a speech to the German people and especially the German refugees. It's a televised address. And in the book, we say, cut and paste this speech to a Palestinian leader. The moment that happens, we know we have peace. He basically tells the Germans, it's over. These lands will never be ours again. They've been gambled a long time ago. We will now return to them. They are now Poland. In saying so, we are not surrendering. We are merely applying common sense. We need to work to the future. Again, look at where West Germany is today and where are the Palestinians. So we don't know if it will take a generation like it took the Germans, but it took 24 years from the moment that there was zero indulgence until a leader emerged who can say that to his people. We don't know how long it will take with the Palestinians. What we do know is that as long as we continue on the course that was set for the last 70 years of indulging this Palestinian vision, there is no way we can get to peace. if I'm going to be the most basic, if we are ever to have peace, the war must end, right? Basic.
Of course, one of the things a little bit different. We were talking about Western ideology, and Germany, of course, did have their notion, but within Muslim ideology, there's also the notion of not giving up a speck of land or anything. There are many who still say they deserve Spain as well, et cetera. So it might be a little bit different. But let me fast forward a little bit to today is July 1. Everyone was holding their breath to see if or what was going to be said. Anything about this issue of extension of sovereignty or annexation. And I don't know, first of all, do you have a preferable term? And what do you think about that? Is this, how does this play into the current situation? Does it have the potential to shake things up a little bit, to be a wake-up call perhaps to the Palestinians, apropos to what you said a moment ago? Or is it something that perhaps will take Israel down a path that will make it that much more difficult to be able to have any kind of agreements with the Palestinians?
So generally my frustration about this whole annexation debate, or whatever you call it, I actually don't mind, is that it focuses again the conflict on land. And the conflict is not about land. So it again puts us in a path which is not going to lead to anything productive. Now, there are those, some on the right, who try to claim that by annexing some of the land, we will send the Palestinians a message that will force them to come to terms with the permanence of Israel. Maybe, but my argument is yes, the way to peace is getting the Palestinians to finally abandon their notion that Israel is a temporary aberration in the region and that they can undo it. But I say deal with it directly. Why go in roundabout ways? Deal with it directly. Dismantle UNRWA. Tell Palestinians they are not refugees. They do not have a right of return. Start giving them the message that all other refugees throughout the 20th century received. Why not handle this directly? Now, the reason also that I fail to get excited either way about this whole thing is that I don't think it makes much of a difference. I don't think it will get the Palestinians to understand that Israel is here to stay, as long as they continue to be indulged in this idea of return. But also, I know that it is reversible. Israel annexed the Golan Heights in 1981 and then proceeded to have very serious negotiations in the 1990s over giving it to Syria. Israel annexed East Jerusalem and had serious negotiations with the Palestinians about giving large parts of it to a Palestinian state. Israel has agreed to make land swaps, which means that it agreed to hand over land over which it is already sovereign. So changing the legal status of the land in a peace agreement is possible. But to get to that situation, we need the Palestinians to begin to be on a path where they understand that the war of 1948 is over, complete, and will not be undone. And I believe that the best way to deal with it is directly rather than in roundabout ways.
So in any dichotomy that you see between Palestinian leadership and Palestinian people, which, perhaps they're pretty consistent, you're saying?
Absolutely. One of the things that I think, again, the book does very well is to really put to bed the myth of the extreme Palestinian leadership and the people who just want to send their kids to college and have a good job, which is also very Western thinking, that's all they want. And if they had money, they'll give it up. And we always say, you cannot bribe people away from their belief that their cause is just. So we already show that already in the 1950s, the Arab refugees themselves are the most extreme element in the Arab world in rejecting any sort of compromise with Israel, any settlement. They assassinate the Jordanian King Abdallah over this issue. So they are the ones who are driving the complete rejection of the state of Israel, of the notion that the war of 1948 is over and that they need to move on. And this is to the present. If anything, the Palestinian leadership is more moderate than the people. and would have been willing to make a deal with Israel had they not known that their people are entirely and completely committed to this idea of return. And like you mentioned in the book, we show that there are no dissenting voices. For a Palestinian leader to emerge, for a Palestinian Willy Brandt to emerge, he needs to at least know that there are some people among his people who will support him. Right now, there is no such thing. And the reason, of course, is because they're massively indulged in this worldview that they are still refugees, that the War of 1948 is not over, and one day they'll undo Israel by return.
I mentioned to you before that I had seen President Clinton shortly after the talks with Ehud Barak and Arafat had broken down. And it was very interesting. It was literally the day after those talks in Camp David. And he expressed surprise. And he said to me in a private conversation, he said, you know, the sticking point was this, the Palestinian refugee right of return. And that it was surprising how surprising that was. I also shared with him the fact that there certainly have been Jewish refugees, almost probably about an equal number from Arab lands, which he had not been aware of either at the time. So this aspect is something that, you know, it needs to be brought out better. Let me ask you this question based on that a little bit. I'm going to go back to ancient history 2 years ago. And that is when Israel passed its controversial nation-state law, that is the nation-state of the Jewish people. Was that part of the subcontext of some of what, you know, the message that it was important to convey, that it is the nation-state of the Jewish people for some of these reasons?
Yes, I think certainly when the law was started, and I was a signatory in the early stages, in the Knesset. The law was started actually by people from Kadima, a centrist party, as an understanding that the negotiations broke down over this recognition, over the Palestinians willing to accept that peace means that the nation state of the Jewish people is here to stay. I mean, really, the shocking thing we discovered is that there was not a moment in nearly 3 decades of negotiations where the Palestinian vision of peace was one where Israel is allowed to stay as the nation state of the Jewish people. I mean, in their mind, it was always a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, plus return, which means that Israel would also in due course become a Palestinian state with a Jewish minority. So yeah, that has been their vision, and it is on us that we were surprised by that, because they have been generally consistent in let's say at the minimum, never saying anything that would contradict their vision that millions of them possess this fictional right of return.
Now, you mentioned something, by the way, in the book, and that is about when Arafat had spoken about the two-phase in 1974, that if we get, and that's one of the differences in much of Palestinian, to the extent there is differences amongst Palestinians. In other words, that we get a small state now and then are able to use it as a launching pad. There again, so many in the West have just ignored that, and just, as well as the other statements that he made, saying, well, this is what I'm saying in English, but I'll say something different in Arabic. So when you talk about Western indulgence, is that part of it as well? Overlooking the reality and having this wishful approach to some of this?
Yes, that is very widespread. Sometimes I compare, especially Israelis, but some Westerners as well, to eager teenagers who get barely a note and they say, oh, she loves me. I mean, we hang on to the slightest Palestinian words as indications that they will forgo this idea of return, that they are ready to make peace with Israel. And one of the things we argue for in the book is that we should be done with this. You know, there was a notion during all the negotiating years of constructive ambiguity. You know, let's keep things ambiguous. The most important thing is the two sides are signatories to some kind of document. And now my argument is, I call it constructive specificity. We need to hear from Palestinians in the clearest possible words. We recognize the Jewish people as a people, not as some followers of a faith, as a people and a nation with a historical connection to this land. We recognize their equal right to self-determination. We will not demand return into the state of Israel. These things need to be said in the clearest possible way. Nothing less than that will indicate that we're on the right track.
So is there anything you think that the government of Israel could be doing differently and better to help to facilitate peace with the Palestinians?
Well, certainly one of my biggest pet peeves with the Israeli government, and especially the security establishment, is the Iron Dome that they provide to UNRWA. Unfortunately, Israel's military is the biggest lobbyist for UNRWA in European capitals. It is under the mistaken impression that UNRWA is a moderating force in the region. One of the things we show in the book is precisely how UNRWA is a radicalizing force. It's not a coincidence that Lebanon and Gaza, where the refugee camp culture is the most intense, is where we had our bloodiest conflicts. We pay in war, in terrorism, in blood for the notion that somehow UNRWA is a moderating force. There's recently been a 3-part documentary in Israel about the war in Lebanon. And it shows the fixation of the military establishment on this security part of Lebanon. And until Ehud Barak took us out of there in 2000, the entire security establishment viewed our presence in Lebanon as the lesser of two evils. This is exactly what they say about UNRWA. That's what they've been saying for 50 years, the lesser of two evils. It's not. And you can listen to the security people talk about how wrong they were not to get out of Lebanon many, many, many years earlier. In the same way, the moment that Israel will remove the Iron Dome that it gives UNRWA, we know of many other countries in Europe who will be happy to stop funding UNRWA, to give Palestinians the clear message. But that is one thing that we can do in a big way.
So I've asked you about Israel. How about American Jews, American rabbis? I mean, obviously, this whole conversation is a message to American Jews and American rabbis. But, you know, are there any particular ways in which we could be playing a constructive role? Because the Israeli-Palestinian issue is so important to so many of us. And that'll be our last question.
To the extent that I can make a recommendation, I think the book brings back the conflict to its core essence. It basically sweeps away the noise that has been created over 70 years of lies. And I think the message is to those who still engage in wishful thinking, in indulging, don't ask any Palestinian counterpart, any speaker for the Palestinians, only one question. Do you recognize the equal right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their homeland? That is that, nothing less. Don't make excuses for them. They know what they're fighting for. Take them at their word. Take them seriously. Don't West Plain for them. I think the more they will find that they are facing a front that is not willing to indulge their visions, the more they're likely to move on a path. And of course, to those who support Democrats, we know that there are many Democrats who are just waiting to get back into power to bring back the funding to UNRWA. No, that would be a massive, huge mistake.
So that was actually, I said the last question next to it. So in terms of the fact that the political sands in America may be changing, and that the Trump administration might be reelected, but based on current polling numbers, it looks like it most likely will not be, and that we may have progressive Democrats more in the fore and in the next administration. So how does that play into any of this, and the message to them as well?
So the message to Democrats, again, to those who still think that the Jewish people have the right to self-determination in their homeland. For those who think we shouldn't, I obviously have nothing to say. I just hope they don't get power. But to those who still support the idea of a sovereign state for the Jewish people, I think it's incredibly important that they understand what the conflict is about, and that if they do want to reach peace by means of a two-state solution, which is what I want, by the way, this is why I wrote the book, they need to help the Palestinians start on a path where they understand that the sovereign state of the Jewish people is here to stay and that they will not undo it by any means possible. And a key element of that is not only not bringing back the funding for UNRWA, is going on a diplomatic campaign with other countries to tell them, get out of UNRWA as well. The Palestinians will never come productively to the negotiating table unless they are ready to make peace with the sovereign state of the Jewish people. I say, let's have a new definition of what it means to be a progressive. Let's agree that being a progressive means giving people the respect of taking them at their word.
That's why I use that term, West planning. Einat Wilf, thank you very much. And to the rabbis and others on our call, I highly recommend the book. It's called The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. A very, very important book to understand the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Please be sure to join us. Go to ZionistRabbis.org to sign up for our call on Monday with Bougie Herzog, I'm sure one of Einat's friends, who is the head of the Jewish Agency, followed by July 15 with David Makovsky and July 22 with Danny Dayan. Take care, everyone, and thank you. We look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.